All right. Well, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you for joining us. My name is Alyssa Miller, and this is the Demystifying DevSecOps webinar. A couple housekeeping items before we get started. First and foremost, we will take questions through the Q&A panel that you have in your GoToWebinar client. So feel free to share those questions with us at any time. We will be addressing as many of those as we can at the end of the webinar. We are also recording this session, so it will be available after the session is completed. We will get those links out to you following today's webinar. So with that, we will go ahead and get started. Again, thank you for joining us. DevSecOps is one of those topics that we hear a lot about it in the industry. There's a lot of noise around it. There's a lot of discussion about the importance of it, but a lot of times there's just not really a really solid understanding of what really does DevSecOps mean and what are effective ways for us to actually approach this within our organizations and make this work. So that's what we're here to talk about today. So let me start by first giving you a little bit of introduction to myself. My name is Alyssa Miller, as I said before, and I'm an application security advocate here at Snyk. I've been a hacker all of my life. When I was 12 years old, I bought myself my first computer, and I've just always liked breaking things. And so eventually, through a roundabout way, that turned into a now 15-year career in security. I've done quite a bit of work in the financial services, the government, and education sectors. But having worked as a consultant for a number of years, I've definitely had exposure to a lot of different industries. With me today, I'm also excited to introduce Jimmy. Jimmy, if you can go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself as well.
Thank you, Alyssa, and thanks, Snyk, for the opportunity to get on this webinar with you guys today. So I'm Jimmy Zhu here. I work for Trace3, one of the service provider, also a partner of Snyk. So I've been doing, call it IT security for about 17 years. Interestingly, I started as a developer, but then quickly, right, one thing led to another to really doing everything InfoSec for the rest of the time, with definitely a focus around security architecture and application security, as well as DevSecOps. So my role actually at Trace3 is the primary evangelist and press leader for AppSec and DevSecOps. Very excited and thrilled to share some discussions with you guys today.
Awesome. So diving right in, every year Snyk does our State of Open Source Security report. And as part of that report, we ask a lot of questions on a survey to folks in the industry. And one of the questions that we typically ask is, who should or who does within your organization own application security? And when we asked this question last year, the results were kind of surprising. As you see here, this was not a single answer question. You can see these numbers add up to more than 100% because the participants were able to select multiple answers. But what you see is far and away, developers were where we were placing the bulk of that responsibility. Now, some of that is a good thing. It's very good to see that we understand the role that developers play in securing our software, but at the same time, this is really indicative of the increasing amount of responsibility we are putting on developers' shoulders in terms of securing the software within our environments.
Yeah, I also like to add that in reality, I think this is a good telling of this of the stats. But what we see out there is that I think while it's true, right, and developers or I'll call it builders are taking more responsibility, but it's not to say that those other teams, whether it's a security team, operations team, don't have a role, right? One of the things that, Alyssa, I know you're not probably hear a lot is everybody's responsible for security, right? It's just if you think about, we call it that there's a 100 to 10 to 1 problem, 100 developers to 10 ops to 1 security SME, right? Hopefully that person knows AppSec. In order to scale, developers, the builders really have to take a bigger responsibility. But in reality, I think it's more around figuring out the RACI model, organization to figure out what exactly are the responsibility, hopefully a lot of them, falls on developer, while these other roles have some form of complementary role to ensure that the security roles are covered, right? That's what we see out there.
So with that in mind, then, I mean, let's talk a little bit more about modern development and some of the real challenges, especially as we move into more of this DevSecOps pipeline or culture, as we'll talk about later. One of the issues that we see around modern development where we put so much weight on our developers is a situation like this. Here you have an application. It's a JavaScript, or a Java application. 3 Java files, 80 lines of code. Now, back in my day when I was a developer, if I had 100,000 lines of code in an application, I wrote those 100,000 lines. That's not the case anymore. What we see is this 80 lines of code. That's all well and great, but then we go and we look and we see, oh, we have all these dependencies defined. And in this case, we've got 7 dependencies. So those are cases where we're now using a package manager, in this case, Maven, to pull in other packages from the open source community in this case. So these are things that are going to get drawn from GitHub or from GitLab or somewhere out there where those packages exist. So the issue here is, yeah, I have those 7 dependencies that I know I've defined in my code. But what I may not have the visibility into is the fact that those 7 dependencies have their own dependencies. And when I start to explore that, I find out they introduce an additional 59 dependencies to my code. And suddenly my 80 lines of code has exploded into 713,000 lines of code. And being aware of what those dependencies are and what it means in terms of security risk can be a real challenge.
Yeah, I mean, this is where I think there's from a developers community, right? I mean, it's almost encouraged to use open source and use the code that people wrote. But the problem, I think, it's more of a software supply chain issue, right? Because you don't know what kind of components out there, right? I mean, the builders just wanted to reuse the code so they don't have to write because they're in a probably tight timeline. But if you think about attack surface, right? When I look at AppSec, right, there's a first-party code that you wrote, and the third-party code, right, where the libraries, frameworks that somebody else wrote that you can just, call a cheat or shortcuts. But if you think about how we address it, it's actually it's a much bigger attack surface for those third-party code because it's like you see, a 7 dependencies turn into a 700,000. So I think it's actually a little easier to detect, right? So while SQL injection is very important, but have visibility around the code you didn't write and what are the implications of that in security, it's probably a lower hanging fruit. And I would encourage that if you're starting off, figure those out first before you deal with your own first party code.
And this is, I mean, that's a really good point you bring up, Jimmy, because when we look across some of these most popular ecosystems and we look at where vulnerabilities are coming from, in so many of them, the vast majority of vulnerabilities actually originate from those indirect dependencies. These are the things we don't know anything about. They're the ones that are hidden behind everything. So we see, for instance, like Node.js, over 85% of the vulnerabilities that we identify in projects are coming from the indirect dependencies, not the ones that the developers know exist, but those ones that are buried beneath the covers. And so when we speak about that idea of the software supply chain and how securing that can be a very powerful adjustment in and of itself before we even get to the code that we've written ourselves, this really shows just the importance that sits behind that.
Yeah, I compare that to like if you're in a restaurant, right? You would source your high ingredients, but you want to see what the source of those ingredients and whether it's meat or seafood, right? If you don't put poor quality ingredients into your food, then it's gonna be bad.
Exactly. That's actually a great analogy. So we saw we put this pressure on our developers, but that's not the only pressure. If we're moving into this DevSecOps pipeline, what about the operations side of things? I love this quote from Kelsey Hightower. Just taking a look at, a very cynical look, but also kind of true. If you're going to roll your application platform, these are all the technologies. This is just a sampling, obviously, but one sampling of the many technologies that our developers who are now defining their application platforms, the infrastructure on which their software is going to run. These are the technologies they have to be aware of. They have to be experts in these things, and we're telling them it's up to them to secure these things. And this is just a small selection. So this creates another challenge for those developers.
Yeah, I would just add that it's definitely, each of these, call it thing on a system platform list is complex enough, right? Developers, they just want to code, right, and build and release production. They got to learn these technologies, but also learn it, use it, and also secure it. It's a lot, right? We'll see later on why that's causing some of the frictions.
Yeah, exactly. So let's talk a little bit deeper about that in terms of containers. So you might be thinking to yourself, well, there are plenty of official container images out there my developers can pull, right? Those are secure. Well, unfortunately, they're not. What we see is that just because a container image is marked as official and it's been assembled and it's long standing is no guarantee that that particular container image that our developers would go out and grab and pull and add to their environment, they may be fraught with vulnerabilities themselves. Here we see Node in particular. That Node image is a vast outlier in this space. But even on the lower end, when we look at things like the MySQL standard image, and we see 67 vulnerabilities, known vulnerabilities that exist in that official image, these are real challenges. When we hear the term official image, there is that tendency from a developer perspective and from an ops perspective to think, okay, it's official, therefore it's been tested, it's been reviewed, I should be safe using this. But the fact of the matter is that official title doesn't excuse us from our tried and true security hygiene that we still need to do as part of introducing infrastructure into our environments.
Yeah, I mean, I think container security can probably be its own discussion for an hour, but I think this context is around the builders having access and have the responsibility to assemble these container images from various sources. Again, it's a supply chain issue, right? And sometimes just because you have the latest version in a Docker file doesn't mean it's the best and most secure version as well. So it just gets complexity of getting the right packages just create a whole different level of challenges.
Yeah. I mean, the good news here is that, okay, these standard images, these were pulled from just the latest tag. And I can say that those latest tags tend to be the largest, most inclusive images. And so when we do slim them down to smaller ones, we do see these vulnerabilities reduced. But that in and of itself is just a challenge to get that awareness out there for not just of our developers, but the security teams as well. And speaking of security, oh my God, security. We are asking our security practitioners to be experts in so many technologies and ideas as well. So we've got this challenge where we're putting a lot of weight on our security folks. We're also putting a lot of weight on those security teams. And as Jimmy, you mentioned before, the 110.1 problem, we're asking that 1% essentially to be responsible for perimeter security, network security, endpoints and applications and data. And oh, by the way, draw up all our policies and help us monitor all this in production besides. It's everything that we ask our security teams to be aware of and to be able to cover in every imaginable technology can be such a challenge when they stand alone as just that security silo that's going to somehow magically protect our entire organization from all the threats that we face.
Yeah, and I want to add another important context here, right? So we talk about DevSecOps, talk about AppSec. I think naturally it has a little bit of intersection with cloud security. You're thinking about, this, of course, can sharpshoot some of the details, but this approach to security has been around, right, since the inception of InfoSec in general. So if you're listening, if you're on the InfoSec side of the house, You probably, you know, myself, right, as a CISSP a long time ago, it's how you learn how to deal with defense in depth, right? Go from the outside in. But if you think about the context for modern application architecture, leveraging cloud, you know, those layers of defense before you get into application and data, I mean, sometimes they're not there, right? It's sometimes they're directly exposed. And so you really got to think about how you deal with it, right? From outside in, really, we promote inside out. I'm a big fan of zero trust. You know, zero trust is a separate discussion outside of scope. We do actually have a different story on that, but it's definitely important to think about InfoSec in general in a different way they would think traditionally. And while the controls are all all hasn't changed much, but how you apply them in a modern application architecture in a cloud environment is very different. Just want to point that out.
And that's one of the things I like on this image is that you have at the core the mission critical assets, right? And it's funny because in security we've used that that castle analogy or metaphor for forever, and people don't like it because it's been used as a way of promoting perimeter security first and that outside in approach. But if you really look at how castles were constructed in medieval times, it's a great metaphor because the way they built those castles was they built a strong keep in the middle first, this large fortified structure where they put their mission critical assets, and then they built all their defenses out from there. They put walls and moats and more walls and all those things around it. And that's how we really need to think about security, especially now as we evolve into this new culture of DevSecOps, where we're trying to speed everything up and enable developers and really create this culture, but it has its challenges. The thing with DevSecOps right now, and really this has been enabled by a lot of the technologies that have been introduced over the last decade or so, is we've got a number of interesting motions. Now, security is pushing left, or we're trying to, and that's been going on for at least 2 decades. As long as I've been really in IT, security has been preaching we need to push left, trying to get integrated early in the development lifecycle. That's been there forever. But what we're seeing on the flip side is we've got developers who are pushing further and further right. As we allow them to define their infrastructure through containers and other things, they're now responsible clear into the deployment and beyond. And then you've got those ops folks who are so used to being able to focus on hardware and steal machines in cabinets and operating systems, who suddenly now have to be so much more aware of the code behind the applications that are running in these containers, because those containers are being tailored for the applications that they're running or the microservices that they're housing and so forth. That now you kind of got this all around motion of everybody's shifting in a very different way than what they've been traditionally responsible for. And so within a DevSecOps environment, we need to focus more on how we integrate those motions together and bring, as you mentioned before, Jimmy, just that common goal behind these teams. How do we get them all aware that they're all responsible for producing code quickly that's both secure and stable? Everybody has that responsibility.
I'm going to add one more variable that's against us: time. Right? If you look at the infinity continuum in the back, right? That's represent DevOps, right? Of course, I'm not going to talk too much about the waterfall to agile to DevOps transformation, but imagine you got to do all that, just like you said, right? But with very minimal time, right? There's no more 6 month to a year releases a day once released, right? It means if you're talking about hours releases, right, in which not everyone's not, if you're listening, not everybody is there today. Some are, some not, but I think the goal is to do it faster and faster. So think about that for a second, right, in terms of how I should do all that in very minimal time. So the goal is, for this one, this webinar is around demystifying DevSecOps. So what are we trying to achieve, right? So you hear up till now, right, all the challenges and contexts we'll have to deal with. But if we do it right, what would it look like, right? So I want to demystify some of the common discussions out there, what it is, what it's not. And as a practitioner, right, both of us see what's out there, what our customers are doing, it's good to highlight, if you do it correctly, what does it look like, and if you, and what are the common pitfalls of what people might think what it is, and when they start doing things and run into call it issues, friction. So I want to highlight a couple key points so we can, so hopefully folks can we can get a better, clear understanding. So if you do DevSecOps properly, right, you actually are value add, able to help the builders release software quickly and reliably, right? And reliably is, quickly is very important because you don't want to slow anything down, right? But reliably is also, it's not just security, right? You want to build quality software. The quality comes in many flavors, not just security. Security is being part of it, right? I don't want you to think about you got to do something special for security. Security defects, bugs, it's just one form of defects and bugs in software engineering, right? One thing I want to point out. But now what I see commonly out there is that in order to make that goal happen, right? Some folks, if you have a legacy AppSec practices, right? If the company is transitioning from the old waterfall to agile now DevOps, right? Some of the naturally some of those existing practices might work well in waterfall environment. It just simply might not work well in a more DevOps agile environment, right? Simply because some of these processes are too heavy. Some of the tooling does not take into consideration around the time you have, right? So think about a static analysis tool that been around for 10, 15 years. Nothing wrong with static analysis, but just you got to have time to deal with false positives, triage. But so and another thing I want to point out is it's very common, right? Vulnerability management program, right? If you think about vulnerability management, typically the security team or the vulnerability management team, they use CVE, CVS scores to prioritize vulnerabilities, right? You can say no zero net vulnerabilities out there, but when we talk about the 700,000 vulnerable libraries that all have high and critical CVS scores, what do you do when you have an hour, right? Think about that. Next, fix but faster, right? So this builds on top of the speed, right? So if we do it correctly, if you prioritize correctly, which we'll go more detail later, then you should not slow development down while fixing bugs. However, next, it does not mean, which I said earlier, that you want to fix all the bugs. It's simply just not possible, right, with the time you have. And just because you think you fix everything today, you know how 0 days, right, come out, right? You never know. I mean, there's always the hackers, like your peers, when you grew up with, they constantly try to find ways to break applications, exploit vulnerabilities. So it's a matter of prioritize. So really, it's not about fix everything, but fix what's most important. Which brings to the third point, right? When we have to do all those things in a very, very short amount of time, you have to decompose and prioritize, right? You can't, and this is where the traditional InfoSec, AppSec, you need to do some tweaking, right? Even, call it the heavy duty, high level security frameworks like NIST, ISO, those are great for compliance, overarching enterprise security programs. And you go specific lower level, right? The Open SAM, BSIMs, AppSec specific, those are great as a framework. However, you really have to prioritize, right, on all these controls. What do you have to do? Decompose security into small components in a DevOps environment, especially around application security, and really focus on come up with metrics, come up with visibility on certain things, on some of the real intelligence to figure out how do you prioritize without slowing things down. So think about when we do things really fast, it becomes continuous, right? So from a security standpoint, you have to, in this case, DevOps itself has, have a lot of these metrics around continuous improvement, continuous measurement. I think security have to do the same thing when you want to align with DevOps. Think about how do you actually measure security improvements, right? Improve security continuously. This lay on to point number 3, right? When you decompose to small pieces and prioritize, you do it over really quickly, then over time you'll show big improvements. Whereas versus traditionally, when you talk about a lot of security, hopefully your security program is not just based on compliance, but compliance play a big factor. But if you look at the security requirements, even AppSec requirements in a traditional sense, you just always look at point in time, right? Pen test, for example, is a point in time. So really, I think about what are you supposed to do, how do you do it in such a way that you can always have real-time feedback continuously? And next. And last thing, probably the most important, right? When you start talk about DevSecOps, people talk a lot about culture, and it's so important, right? Now, if you do number 1 through number 4 properly, then it's it helps, right? So we have the silos. Right? Silos always going to be there, but how do we actually break the silos, collaborate, right? The dev, the ops, the security needs to collaborate. Don't point fingers. Right, in the traditional sense, I think Alexa talked earlier, but we see that in old days, right, when developers develop, code, and then you throw over the fence, right, and sometimes you call it a grenade, and it explodes, and you start pointing fingers. Oh well, you wrote bad code, or ops, you didn't do your job. So really, we got to get away from the blame culture and think about blameless. Don't blame each other. Collaborate as early, as often as possible, but definitely you want to work in a positive manner.
So let's talk a little bit more about how we do this, right? So we think about that traditional approach that we want to eliminate. What does that look like? Security for the longest time has been the gate. We've always been the gate between the various stages of development. And indeed, for many, many years, we actually promoted this idea as a good thing. This was our goal. And I can go back to many conference talks and papers I've seen written where they talked about implement a quality gate at each of these phases. The problem with DevSecOps is that doesn't work. Those feedback cycles are long. As Jimmy mentioned, you go, take SAST, for instance. So here we see SAST sitting as that gate between code commit and the build test cycle. Well, how long does it take to run our code through a SAST cycle? Sometimes that can be days, depending on the size of the code commit and what we're scanning and what our rules are, and what we're doing in terms of trying to weed out false positives and other noise and prioritizing that. So those long feedback cycles that then oftentimes where that gate would force another round of code before they could move on to build or move beyond, that doesn't work. That doesn't enable developers. It doesn't create this, what we call frictionless enablement environment, where our developers are empowered to do the things that they need to do, and our security practices are just a part of that does not create friction in their day-to-day activities. So what we need to do within security is shift from this model of being the gate to being integrated into those various phases of the development pipeline. So starting off with threat modeling very, very early in the backlog when we're writing those user stories, and then bringing things like pre-commit checks and our SCA into the code commit. Let's be right there in the repository with them. And SAST just being part of our build test cycle, and so on and so on. The goal here, though, is that those feedback cycles need to happen as part of that phase, not a situation where a developer feels they've completed a phase, we run our gate, they don't pass the gate, and it comes back to that same phase again. Those are the things that stand in the way, and ultimately they result in problems with adoption and getting those people to adopt the security practices we want them to adopt.
Very good point, Alyssa. Also, I wanted to add a couple more things, right? If you take all that, right, let's apply the speed variable again. We have to do it really, really fast. What does that mean, right? Some practical, we'll call it the devices here, right? When you talk about threat modeling, then you really think about, you don't do those long, comprehensive threat modeling anymore, right? You want to do rapid threat modeling, right? There's some frameworks out there like Stride, right? And there's a rapid, I think Mozilla rapid risk assessment. Those kind of frameworks out there are meant for you to do something very rapid, very quick, so you don't slow things down, but also to the point, figure out what's most important. Again, prioritize. Before I get to the unit test, can you go back? Sorry, some more things. I want to talk about runtime, right? Runtime protections. With technology nowadays, you're able to kind of give real-time intelligence on what's actually being, what kind of attacks actually are exploiting to your application, so you can feed that feedback back to development to prioritize. But one more thing about pen test, right? This is something I want to point out. We've been doing pen tests for a long time, right? Whether it's a compliance check, whether it's a last day before you release production, or ongoing assessment and production. Very important. Now, if you do those things correctly, or if you implement all these controls that you mentioned in development, right, and do it really fast, you can actually reduce or reprioritize what you need to test, right? So the test doesn't become, if you do all these things properly, you probably don't have to spend as much time testing the OWASP top 10. You could be testing the cloud controls, the control plane. You can be testing about how exactly our secure is a pipeline, right? If somebody you're a hacker, how easy is to own a Jenkins server, right? So you can actually reprioritize the security pen test if you do those other things. One last thing about remediation. You see security unit tests there, right? You can pen test the same thing over and over again. But the cheapest way for remediation doesn't happen again is if you're testing the business logic, which you should be testing, right? You don't want testing things that automated tool can't catch. If you can write a simple unit test, test case, then you don't have to ever test again, right? And just naturally is remediate. I want to point that out, as in these are some of the patterns that we see are actually can make things more effective. Okay, so I think by now, I think everybody agreed on that. So we really got to work on developers, right? So this is actually a survey, which in line what we see out there, right? In order to make sure there's no friction, right? There's so many developers out there versus the SMEs like us. So we have to make them happy, right? So the survey found that the happier they are, the more likely they like to pay attention. So I want to kind of talk about what that means, right? Next slide. I think in the last couple of years, I really think that in the old days, maybe because the culture, there's a lot of friction, called bad blood, right? But I think in the last couple of years, I think the industry did a good job of creating awareness around security, right? Around DevSecOps, talks, DevOps, the DevOps days, right? DevSecCon. And I think it's not just the developers they inherently don't care; they care about security. I see a lot of developers we talk to, right? Whether it's during our survey, during consulting engagements, they all care. But just because they care doesn't mean they're happy, right? So I'm going to show you some of the things that make them unhappy. So if we do some form of AppSec, right? And let's say you start out right doing DevSecOps, you're shifting left, right? But some still think that they found a problem too late, right? It's much easier and much better if you can figure out, if you think about the slide you shared earlier, right, about a generic SDLC pipeline, the earlier that they find out a problem, the easier, less effort for them to fix it. The later they found out doing late stage QA, those end-to-end testing, pre-pod, you tell them, hey, it's a problem. Maybe early on, it's as simple as upgrade a package, but the later you are, right, and the more complex it is. So they would much prefer they find the problem even earlier. Next. The second thing is, again, we talk about this enough, right? You cannot slow them down. They don't want to be slowed down. They are under objective of release to production quick, right? And a lot of times the bonus is paid on how quickly they can release new features. So they definitely don't want to slow it down. I'll talk about it more later, but one common error, I want to hit it again, but I want to think it's important enough. Just because you do automated fail to build with automated security automation with static analysis, that doesn't mean it's probably the best thing to do in the beginning. And sometimes that slows it down because now you break the build, but you got to take a lot of time to fix it. I'll talk more about that later. The third thing is expectations, right? We found out that, we talked about earlier on your first slide, talked about, responsibilities, right? Developers are owning more and more of the AppSec responsibilities, but still we see a lot of times that, there's a preach around everybody owns, has ownership, various type of ownership, roles of responsibility for security, but oftentimes the expectation for developers is not clear. Next. Training is also one of my favorite, right? If you're on the InfoSec side, right? So if you implement security awareness training, security training program, you typically do, there's an evolution of, nobody does that by PowerPoint. And we all know that already. Then the next evolution is computer-based training, CBTs, right? Sometimes, as part from an organizational standpoint, you make it mandatory. Great. But when it comes to developer training, they don't have that kind of time, right? And they're, I call it the different type of personalities. Some of the customers I talk to, right, they folks actually do it and pretty effective. They want to think about what's fun, right? They want to give more incentives. So you want them to own more responsibility around secure code. You want to enable them with a training that makes sense, that's fun, right? So something like gamified, right? And something that's not necessarily saying you have to do it, but you enable them to, hey, this is what you should do. But what I've seen out there is that some organizations, they create incentives, right? With taking the training. But most of the time, when they don't call it the pushback and they're not happy because either they have no training or the training that's been forced down to them are not the one that they, will make them want to do it. Next slide. Next point. So nobody likes to repeatedly doing the same thing manually, right? Going back to they don't want to be slowed down. So there's two contexts to this. One is everybody loves automation, right? If you can automate some of the manual tedious tasks over and over, it's great. But another thing is when you enable developers to, some team, they use, do a self-service model where, you give a developer access or enable them to use, call it some of the code analysis tools, like a SAS analysis. But then if the process is manual of using that tool, right? And, you don't really integrate into their environment, then they push back, right? Now they gotta learn a new tool, gotta learn new processes. It doesn't match what they're already doing with the code SDLC. So that's another important fact. Now that lays into the complexity effect of tools, right? So this one laid into what I just said earlier, right? Some tools, I like to say that, some in general are, InfoSec tools. A lot of them are, I call them narcissistic, right? Hey, use my process, look at my dashboard, log into my portal and use it. But again, when you put the hands in developers and they become the consumer of the tool, you got to really think about how to make it easy for them, so they don't have to spend a lot of time learning, but also they have to be effective so don't slow them down, but also need to be integrated into their process. So real quickly, next, show you really, so if you do it correctly, you want to produce happy developers who care about security, then you really have to think about how you're going to do those, address each of those points on the right now. I can tell you that it can happen, right? There are ways out there that can make it happen so that they get more likely to be happy, more likely to care about security, and it will be happy days for everybody. Next slide.
So let's talk a little bit about some strategies for how we do this. So one of the key things, to summarize a lot of those points, is really we need to start reducing the noise and fatigue. So to speed up those feedback cycles and really make use of each of these tasks throughout, how do we integrate? I'm going to use threat modeling as an example. So I mentioned earlier pushing threat modeling all the way into the backlog. So if we've got business people writing our user stories, and we equip those business people to identify what those critical assets are and write the potential abuse stories, the things that are most threatening to those critical assets. If we add those early in the creation of a user story, now we can start to focus on threat modeling, be more of a continuous improvement practice rather than trying to threat model an entire system and saying we're going to understand all the threats to this system. We need to get incrementally better. So when I put that into the user story, now that carries through the rest of my pipeline because that information now carries into my sprint planning. And I can leverage that threat model information to really prioritize which elements from my backlog I'm going to pull and make a part of my sprint. What are the things that I'm going to eliminate if I'm overcommitted for my sprint? What am I putting back to the backlog? How do I prioritize that? Where does the risk fit in the picture of risks and threats versus new functionality? And we start to equip those folks, that whether they're our sprint architects or whoever is responsible for that sprint planning, we equip them with more knowledge than they had before. But then that carries on. So we move that user story into our sprint. We begin the sprint. Because we built that threat modeling information into that part of the user story, when that lands on a developer's plate for them to begin designing and coding, they are now informed of what is most critical in terms of security controls. They are able to see from a business perspective what matters most in terms of the threats, and now they can design controls around that. This has the really nice side effect of now linking not only our development, but also our security controls back to business priorities. And so now we're in effect truly reducing business risk and appropriately prioritizing business risks that we choose to remediate in our code and in our security designs. But it doesn't end there. Since we've defined these security controls and we've defined the abuse stories, we know what those look like. This feeds into the CI/CD pipeline or into whatever model we're following, and it feeds into it in the form of our user test cases. I can now leverage that information to define those unit test cases that I'm going to execute as part of that overall test build cycle. And now that makes that process more efficient. So what I've done here is I've reduced the noise that results in new backlog entries because I've used one simple piece of this security practice to feed into all subsequent phases. And this is what we need to be doing. This is why we want developers and security and operations and truly business involved in that DevSecOps pipeline. Thinking ahead to a few other items as we try to build out on a lot of those concepts that Jimmy was talking about. How do we start to build that empathy and bring them together? The first is this idea of walking a mile in their shoes. How do we get security and operations to understand the mindset of a developer and vice versa? Spending time in job shadowing or building in different key tasks where those folks are working together starts to build that empathy. So as our security teams are looking to implement new practices, they better understand the perspectives of the developers and the operations folks. Developers, as they're looking for new ways to get faster and faster, they understand the perspectives of security and they can start to build their processes to accommodate those areas that security is going to be most concerned with. It takes away that adversarial siloed approach that we're so used to and starts to create more of a cooperative approach. From there, we can really look at how do we set up more of a mutual engagement. Do we have security practitioners attending our stand-ups for the development teams? Are operations involved in sprint planning so that they can help prioritize and identify key controls and things that will need to be implemented, and which of those user stories make the most sense, or where there might be potential issues from an operations perspective with a particular user story requiring some additional consideration. Bringing those and making their daily tasks more integrated, again, helps us build that all-important culture, which is really what's at the heart of building out DevSecOps in your organization. DevSecOps is so much more than tooling. It's so much more than process. It's really how do we build that collaborative culture. And then finally, and this is the one that always seems to trip people up, it's the idea of paving the road from that user story through to deployment and beyond. How do I, as a security person or as somebody tasked with developing my DevSecOps culture, how do I create a path that my secure path, the preferred path that I want my development teams, my operation teams to follow, is the easy path. It's the one that they want to follow. It's that paved road that they can follow, and it's going to get them to deployment faster and easier than if they tried to circumvent my security tools and my security processes. This is the key to truly enabling DevSecOps and getting developers to really adopt those security practices and initiatives that we want them to adopt. So how do we do it? We need to meet them where they live. We've talked about this idea of frictionless enablement a number of times. And what's crucial here is to make that happen, to pave that road for them, we need to make sure that our security practices, our security tools are not only tools that they'll use, but that integrate in the world that they already live in. We talked early on when I was talking about ops and all the technologies that developers need to be aware of to roll their own infrastructure. Even just developing within each of these ecosystems requires integration into all of these different technologies. We see the continuous integration tools, the different code repositories, obviously being in part of their IDE. If they're doing containers, embedding security into that. By making security part of that tooling, we can now begin to make that secure road the easy road, because they see how it eliminates those long feedback cycles. Those things that make them unhappy developers start to disappear because the security is happening. Imagine a developer being able to type a line of code in their IDE and have it immediately tell them, hey, you've introduced a new vulnerability here. Do you want to fix it right away? That, not only does that help the developer immediately, it makes them smarter in terms of how they develop secure code going forward. It enables them with new knowledge that's going to speed up their development process overall. That's the key to paving the road for developers and making sure that they're going to adopt secure practices.
Yeah, I think all another thing to add is, like Alexa said, DevSecOps is not about tooling, not just about tooling. But tooling is also, it has an important factor, right? So meet them where they live, looking at the pipeline. If you're evaluating tools, right, whether it's open source, commercial, various, AppSec and tools here and there, monitoring tools, protection tools, it seems very important as part of metrics, evaluation criteria to think about how the tool play into developer's process. So integrating with those, those every logo or whatever you use in the development environment in your CI pipeline is important, but also flexibility of having for developers to customize, right? Have these REST API integrations so they don't have to log into your portal, even though your portal, it might be the best portal in the world, you might market, but can they build dashboards based on the API integrations, right? So that's very important in terms of evaluation. So to sum it up, right? We really hope that whether you are the builder or the defender, I like to call them, or whether you're starting to explore how to actually take that and build that programming in your organization, or you've made some progress. Hopefully you see something that you can take away. But really sum up of distill all the talks into 5 practical tips I want to share with everybody you can take away from this webinar, right? The number 1 is really the builders, right? It's all about the builders. We want to, in order to scale, right? As the survey says in the first slide, right? We definitely want the builder to take more responsibility so everybody can scale, but you really want to make sure to properly enable them, you have to equip them with the right training, right? The right tools, of course, the right processes. Don't slow them down, make them happy, but also set very clear expectations of what's their responsibility, what's yours, what's everybody else's, so they know, right? Also, before we get to the second one, so I think one of the slides you said on the build empathy culture, right? So important to build those security champions, right? Cross-functional teams, walk a mile, right? All those are all, to me, our enablements. Next. The second thing, right? I talked about earlier, I think this is also very, very, very important, right? This is aligned to the reduced noise fatigue, right? It's as if you're an InfoSec practitioner, right? We always want to think about frameworks, think about controls, think about compliance. Great, but really have to tailor and be able to customize our AppSec or security InfoSec program with a DevOps mindset, which means I love the acronym for DevOps, COMS, right? Which stands for culture. Alyssa, you talk about culture a lot, right? Think about a collaborative culture, blameless culture. A, it means automation, right? How do we apply automation properly so it can speed things up, right? L, lean. This is the prioritization, reduce noise fatigue, and how do you tailor and customize your overarching security program and AppSec program to be lean, focus on what's the most important, break security down into small pieces, tied to the user stories, tied to the threat modeling, right? Instead of trying to do everything through each iteration. M means metrics. Metrics also, of course, you got to come up with metrics, but important to unify the metrics. DevOps have its own metrics. SecOps have its own metrics. But when you build shared metrics, right? One, measure performance typically, or another one measure security threats, but there are often a lot of correlation between the two, right? So unified metrics have bi-directional feedback loops. That actually helps a lot with the sharing culture, which the S stands for sharing. You really can't have silos. Share, lesson learn, participate in each other's, call it stand-ups, right? just start sharing the data, which goes to my next point. I think it's the one next. Actually, it's number 4. I'll talk about it on the sharing a bit more on point number 4. The third thing is, so you're seeing our, call it very high level sample SDLC / I wouldn't call it pipeline. The reality is there's a lot of DevSecOps reference architectures out there. And some organizations probably did a build of, I think I've seen about 50 of them, right? You got to build one that's fit for you. There's no one size fits all, but some principles are very important to highlight. You want to shift left. Of course, I don't hate that term. I like, the extending to the left. I like the push left because, trust me, some I talk to, they think that if shift left, it just means that let's go back, let's build some IDE plugins, which is very important to enable developers, like you said, right, to have real-time feedback on the IDEs. But that's not the only place you should have it, right? You can integrate the repo. The reason that you want to, extend everywhere, right? Not just very left, but every section, because there's a role, right? In security, we call it there's a trust but verify, right? You want to enable developers to fix things early, no doubt, it's cheaper, but you want to check the balances. When you have CI doing integration during the build phase, hopefully you don't fail the build in the very beginning, but once you fine tune the process, that's another way to do checks, right? If you plan for it properly, then you can catch things that you might have missed, right? Shift to the right or extending to the right, very important. I talked about unified metrics, share feedback loops. From the monitoring standpoint and runtime protection, it's also important going to the right? Both between DevOps and SecOps. To be able to help prioritize, to focus on what's most important, it's important to threat modeling, do all that, like you said, but there's also another piece of data, right? The real world attacks, right? The real world threat intel can also feed into to the dev team on what's focused on what's most important to remediate, right? And we got to make sure we automate correctly. Next. So I said I want to talk about sharing, right? The culture and sharing in acronym comms. So one way to share, right? And of course, you want to have collaborative culture, everything. But I talk about the two-way feedback loop, right? I just actually just talked about it on number 3 as well. In two-way feedback loop, really think about how do we share the feedbacks, right? In development, when you have the security integration into various stages, call it security testing, software bill of material, in order to, as a security practitioner, another way to look at how do you actually enable developers to move fast, and when in terms of prioritizing what to fix, it's important to be lean on focus on what's most important. But as you speed up the SDLC, speed up the release frequency, there might come a time where you have to make a conscious decision to say, I found these 3 critical issues, but I only have time to do 1. What is the compromise? So in that way, it becomes more important for the SecOps to get feedback. Okay, I'm making a decision with compensated controls, hopefully, that I'm allowing this push to go in production, but I'm pay close monitor to these issues might happen in real life, right? So that's why it's important to get metrics from the dev side, right? It's not just for SecOps. It's not just about getting firewall logs anymore. It's not just about getting endpoint EDR logs anymore. It's about have visibility into the AppSec side of the house in the development. But on the other side of it, on the SecOps, right? And you should feed some of the threat intel on the real world attacks into DevOps or development, right, for the builders, so they can actually think about, okay, I have these 10 vulnerabilities, right? They all exploitable, but I'm really getting feeds for real attacks for these 2. So I really have to do whatever I can to fix those, right? Next. You just talked about meet them where they live, right? I don't want to speak too much more on this. You really have to focus on, if you want the builders to take on more responsibilities, the tooling, the process have to align to what they're used to, not the other way around. Very, very important. And I'd say anything I add?
Yeah, so I want to say really quickly, again, a quick reminder, if you have any questions, please add those to the Q&A panel. I do want to say thank you so much, Jimmy, for joining me today, and for all you folks for joining us as well and for your attention. So far, we got one question out there asking, so you mentioned metrics. Are there 1 or 2 particular metrics that are crucial for measuring DevSecOps success?
Liz, you want to?
So
What do you think?
yeah, I mean, I can address that. You know, I think one of the key factors when we look at DevSecOps is really understanding if well, let me talk about what you don't want to measure first. Measuring things that are arbitrary, like arbitrary numbers of vulnerabilities discovered or whatnot, things of that nature. Are, you know, those very low level. They seem objective, but honestly, they lack context. So when you're trying to build out metrics that you're going to use to measure the success of your DevOps program or your DevSecOps program, what you really want to be focused on is something that gives you the overall measure of, are you continuously improving? So looking at things like mean times to remediation of your vulnerabilities. So not how many do we discover or how many do we fix, but how long does it take us from the time that we identify them to when they get repaired? Or looking at, oftentimes you can look at performance of a user story. How many vulnerabilities and other bugs were identified per user story, and start to bring that back, because now that starts to speak to the longer term improvements that you can make. It helps you understand, is DevSecOps really having the impact that we want on our environment? Anything you would add to that, Jimmy?
I'm glad you mentioned mean time to remediation. I think it's very important. I think it's better metrics through my experience than mean time to detection. It measures how quickly you can remediate, right? But also, I think talk about unified metrics. Also good to add that, you got to understand, as on the security side of the house, understand what are the objectives for the dev and DevOps team, right? So what's their release production frequency, right? I can't think off the top of my head, but whether it's today or in the future, right? If they say we're releasing once a week, but you know that their objective is actually going to release twice a day, right? Keep that in mind and compare that with your mean time to resolution to remediation, right? Think about how you can improve on that, right? Building a partnership, right? And I think in the DevOps community, they talk about the more often release, just not because you have to, but if you can do CI/CD multiple releases a day, that means you can actually improve actual security, right? So imagine if you have a real attack vulnerability that your SecOps get a feed, right? So having that metric can allow you to say, if we can do, from a code commit to do a fix and do the release production within an hour, then having that metric is important to say we can actually remediate, right? And also in line with the time to release to production frequency.
Awesome. Well, that's the only question we had. So, and that works out well because we're just about out of time anyway. So once again, thank you all for joining us. Really appreciate it. You have our information there, both mine and Jimmy's. If you want to continue the conversation outside of this session today, you're more than welcome. Again, appreciate all your participation, and take care. Have a wonderful weekend, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.